World War I was the war to change all wars and a key factor to the evolution of the lost generation. Defined as the generation of men and women who came of age during or immediately following World War I, the lost generation was a result of war experiences and the social upheaval of the time, as cynical, disillusioned, and without cultural or emotional stability. Taking place between the years of 1914 and 1918, World War I brought great disillusionment concerning the purpose of honor towards war to those fighting as well as those at home. When the war ended, its harsh realities and aftermath had crashed over the American people, many of those being a part of the younger generation. Not knowing how to deal with World War I's brutal effects or the gruesome acts of war, its repercussions on those who fought, how it affected those back home, and the strain it put on America's economy, many of the generation fled to Europe. At the epicenter of it all, Paris was where many belonging to the lost generation became artists, using the war as a catalyst to their works. The war caused this generation to be lost at heart and mind, and they found a salvation of self through expressing their hardships.
Hemingway.
Hemingway?
You like my book?
Liked? I loved all your work.
Yes, it was a good book because it was an honest book. And that's what war does to men. And there's nothing fine and noble about dying in the mud.
Ernest Hemingway was a major figure in the lost generation. Born in 1899, Hemingway started his career as a writer in a newspaper office in Kansas City at the age of 17. After the United States entered the First World War, he joined a volunteer ambulance unit in the Italian Army. Serving at the front, he was both wounded and decorated. After his return to the United States, he became a reporter for Canadian and American newspapers and was soon sent back to Europe to cover events such as the Greek Revolution. Spending much time in hospitals, Hemingway witnessed much of the physical and mental horrors of war. In the 1920s, Hemingway became a member of the Lost Generation in Paris. Hemingway's literary works portray his experiences during war and depict the truths of war and its resulting effects. Some of these novels include his famous The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and The Old Man in the Sea. Hemingway liked to portray soldiers, hunters, and bullfighters. Tough at times, but primitive people whose courage and honesty are set against the brutal ways of modern society, and who in this confrontation lose hope and faith. His straightforward prose and his spare dialogue are particularly effective in his short stories. Ernest Hemingway took the hardships from around the time of World War I and successfully turned them into literature that is still praised to this day. Hemingway died in 1961. World War I led to all of the major contributions to the people of the 1920s becoming lost. Many of the soldiers involved were deployed at a young age, while they were still learning how to become adults. This led the people who went to war to be molded by bloodshed, and the ones left behind at home to attempt to put the pieces of their lives together. The war also took the bravery and heroism of battle away from the young people of the generation. World War I seemed to have destroyed the idea that if you acted virtuously, good things would happen. Instead, men found themselves rotting away in the trenches of Europe and receiving no recognition for their trials on their return home. The government had led them down the path of war at a young age and alienated them on their return, leading to a prominent air of skepticism in 1920s America. Once the lost generation had returned to normal life, they digressed away from supporting the government and predominantly distrusted those working the system. One main contribution for such actions was Prohibition. The movement towards Prohibition began in 1916, when the First World War was in full swing and was put into practice 1 year after the war ended. The younger generation was already pessimistic and trusting the government due to the involvement of the war, and Prohibition, which chiefly went into effect while the war was being fought, led to an outright rebellion against authority. This ushered the rising generation to feel ostracized by their processors, those who led them to grow up by the will of the war and now obtained the audacity to tell them how to live their lives when they returned. Obvious rebellion broke loose after the 18th Amendment went into action, giving rise to the gangster and speakeasy and making disobeying the government a day-to-day action.
Novel.
Oh, yes? I'm Zelda, by the way.
Right.
Oh, Scott?
Yeah.
Scott.
Yes,
come
what
on
is
here.
it, sweetheart?
Here's a rider from,
Oh, a
where?
rider.
California.
Scott Fitzgerald. And who are you, old sport?
Gil. The same names as
As what?
Scott Fitzgerald and
Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, the Fitzgeralds. Isn't she beautiful?
Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul, Minnesota on September 24, 1896. On academic probation and unlikely to graduate from college, Fitzgerald joined the Army in 1917. In the June of 1918, Fitzgerald was assigned to Camp Sheridan near Montgomery, Alabama. There, he fell in love with Zelda Syrie. The war ended just before he was to be sent overseas, and after his discharge in 1919, he went to New York City to seek his fortune in order to marry. Unwilling to wait while Fitzgerald succeeded in the advertising business and unwilling to live on his small salary, Zelda Syrie broke their engagement. Then, the publication of This Side of Paradise on March 26, 1920, made Fitzgerald famous almost overnight at the age of 24, and a week later he married Zelda. Fitzgerald endeavored to earn a solid literary reputation, but his playboy image impeded the proper assessment of his work. Literary opinion makers were reluctant to recognize Fitzgerald as a serious writer due to his reputation as a drinker. The Fitzgerald spent the winter of 1924 in Rome, where he revised The Great Gatsby. They were en route to Paris when the novel was published in April. The Great Gatsby marked a striking difference in Fitzgerald's technique. His achievement received critical praise, but sales of Gatsby were disappointing. F. Scott Fitzgerald died, believing himself a failure. The obituaries were condescending, and he seemed destined for literary obscurity. However, by 1960, he had achieved a secure place among America's eternal writers. E. Cummings was an American poet, painter, essayist, author, and playwright. His body of work encompasses approximately 2,900 poems, 2 autobiographical novels, 4 plays, and several essays. In 1917, Cummings enlisted in the Ambulance Corps. However, due to administrative mix-up, was not assigned to an ambulance unit for 5 weeks, during which time he stayed in Paris. He fell in love with the city, to which he would return throughout his life. Cummings returned to Paris in 1921 and remained there for 2 years before returning to New York. He also returned during the late 20s and 30s. Cummings was a brilliant writer and became exceedingly well known for works such as I Carry Your Heart With Me, I Carry It in My Heart, The Enormous Room, and Tulips and Chimneys.
I can never decide whether Paris is more beautiful by day or by night.
No, you can't. You couldn't pick one. I mean, I can give you a checkmate argument for each side. You know, I sometimes think, how's anyone ever going to come up with a book or a painting or a symphony or a sculpture that can compete with a great city? You can't, because like you look around, every street, every boulevard is its own special art form. And when you think that in, the cold, violent, meaningless universe that Paris exists, these lights, I mean, come on, there's nothing happening on Jupiter or Neptune, but from way out in space, you can see these lights, the cafes, people drinking and singing. I mean, for all we know, Paris is the hottest spot in the universe.
Along with not supporting the government as a byproduct of the war, being lost and a sense of being nomadic was very common. Notable figures like Gertrude Stein, Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, and F. Scott Fitzgerald found themselves in Paris, all to avoid the criticisms of society, prohibition, and the political atmosphere. Paris became the city for the lost and confirmed the separation between those of the lost generation and those who felt accepted by the 1920s American society. According to Fitzgerald, either you think or else others have to think for you and take power from you, pervert and discipline your natural taste, civilize and sterilize you. The people of the lost generation were people with minds of their own, minds that were hesitant to irrevocably trust the government and minds that were willing to explore the world around them as a consequence of World War I. As a result, many fled to Paris and produced works of art and literature that eternally encompassed the lives of the 1920s Lost Generation. All in all, Paris was one of the main themes during the Lost Generation. As well as rebellion and tragedy, the people during this time were trying to find their own morals and values and were on the pursuit to finding themselves. Paris was a main factor because many people who were in the war didn't feel like they belonged at home. These writers who went to Paris are still some of the most well-known